Dawn slid over the Texas Panhandle on May 20th, 1943, painting the wire at Camp Hereford a tired bronze. The air tasted of dust and mesquite smoke, dry enough to rasp the throat, and the wind skimmed the barracks with a faint, tinny whine. Sergeante Carlo Bianchi, his boots still floured with Tunisian grit, stood in a chow line that curled toward the mess hall. He kept his eyes low, the habit of men who no longer trusted horizons, and listened to a sound he had almost forgotten, beef meeting iron with a bright, cheering sizzle. Inside, U.S. Army cooks moved with unshowy precision. Aprons swung, spatulas clicked, fat popped and ran to a grease trap in quick silver threads. At a side table, a corporal levered caps from green glass with a practiced flick, and each bottle of Coca-Cola answered with a neat little hiss. The room smelled of coffee, onions, scorched bread, and the sweetness of frying. For a heartbeat, the scent lifted Carlo home to Lombardy, his mother's winter stew, steam fogging the window, before the present reasserted itself with the clatter of trays and the sharp, clean bite of carbonation. Only a week earlier, on May 13th, the Axis in Tunisia had surrendered. A human tide so large, Allied officers called it the biggest bag since 1918. Numbers were rumors to most soldiers, but this one stuck. More than 238,000 prisoners. Of them, roughly 51,000 to 55,000 Italians were shipped to the United States. Carlo's convoy had threaded the Atlantic beneath destroyer escorts steady as sheepdogs. He remembered diesel and brine, the green wall of water, and the hush that fell when the Statue of Liberty surfaced from the fog like a rumor of some generous future. He had expected punishment. He had braced for hunger. Instead, there was procedure. Hereford looked like procedure made visible. 10 fenced acres held barracks enough for 4,000 prisoners. Towers topped with Browning .30 caliber guns watched the yard. Floodlights washed the gravel at night until darkness retreated into the fence corners. Yet, what undid him was not the wire, but the kitchen. Article 11 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, thumbtacked on a board in Italian, promised the same rations as U.S. depot troops. Field Ration A, the garrison standard, meant fresh meat and vegetables, bread with butter and jam, coffee with sugar, and, where supply allowed, ice cream. He learned the number attached to the promise. An American depot soldier could expect roughly 3,400 calories a day. To a man who had sometimes fought on less than 1,000, the figure felt like a statistic from another planet. Captain James Tex Harlan, the quartermaster officer, moved along the line with a clipboard and a rancher's unconcern. He checked refrigerator thermometers, wagged a finger at a private about slicing onions too thick, initialed a crate stamped by a traveling bottler. Harlan understood that behind each patty stood stockyards, railheads, cold storage, timetables, and a doctrine that treated supply as a weapon system. Calories and cartridges moved by the same logic: plan, load, deliver. The country that could fight on 2 oceans could feed enemy prisoners to the same standard it fed its own depot troops, not from sentiment, but from capacity. Carlo edged forward. The cook saluted with his spatula and settled a patty on a bun already touched with relish and onion. The bun was warm. Juice ran over his knuckles. A private slid a Coca-Cola across the counter, and the glass was so cold it bit the fingers. He raised it, heard the clean psst as the cap yielded, and tasted the thin, electric sweetness. Kitchen noise slipped away. In that pocket of quiet, he recognized what his mind had resisted since capture. Not humiliation, but conclusion. A system that could make this breakfast routine would not be beaten by speeches, or by promises of sacrifice, or by the last reserves of a hungry empire. He would later say the tears surprised him. They came because the hamburger tasted of ordinary life, and because ordinary life here was manufactured at a scale that could serve it to prisoners without strain. The bulletin board law mattered because the nation behind it could keep the promise. He swallowed coffee that smelled like staying alive and felt his chest loosen. Relief, grief, and the odd, disorienting gratitude of a man whose enemy refused to hate him. Outside, The sun burned the flats until the dust glittered. A whistle thinned across the distance, and somewhere a refrigerated rail car clanked, full of beef on ice, bound for another camp, another line, another quiet revelation. Carlo wiped his hands on his tunic and finished the bottle. The glass chimed when he set it on the counter. The line moved. The grill kept its steady hymn. He squared his shoulders and stepped forward, the taste of cola bright on his tongue, already suspecting that this small breakfast would be the truest briefing he would receive about how the war would end. The troop ship had smelled of oil and salt and wool, a layered odor that clung to the skin like fatigue. Days before the Texas sunrise, Carlo had leaned against a steel rail and watched the Atlantic roll past in slabs of green, the swell lifting the bow as if weighing it in a slow hand. Men kept their distance from the horizon. They learned to study the deck instead: boots, rope, the shadows of signal flags flipping in the wind. Somewhere below, engines thrummed at a patient, confident pitch. American destroyers kept station on either quarter, their wakes scribbling white signatures across the sea. The escorts looked bored, which was the most frightening thing about them. The calm of a nation for whom ocean crossings had become logistics, not peril. Memory returned him to Tunisia, to the last week before surrender on May 13th. Rations had thinned to biscuits brittle as plaster. Water tasted of rust and effort. The hot wind came full of grit, and the sky over the ridges shook with Allied air like a continuous storm. He remembered the clattering dive of a P-40 strafing a road bend, dust leaping from the shoulders, and the quick, humiliating flinch that his sergeant pretended not to see. There had been talk that relief would come. There had been talk that the enemy could not possibly replace the planes he shot down or the tanks he burned. The talk ended when columns of prisoners began to move like rivers, Germans and Italians together, toward holding pens so broad they looked like new countries thrown up overnight. On the ship, he met an older corporal from Naples who had fought the last winter in a tunic gone the color of bad tea. The man had a habit of counting under his breath, as if inventorying things he no longer owned. When Carlo asked what he was counting, the corporal answered, "Everything we thought the other side could not have more of." The phrase stayed with him through the long transit, through the neutral-smelling meals, through the moment the skyline of New York rose and stilled the deck. They passed the statue, and even the most hard-mouthed prisoners let their eyes climb. The camp in Texas translated that skyline into ground truth. Procedure, fences, towers, yes. But also the kitchen and the bulletin board with the 1929 Geneva Convention clipped in 3 languages. Article 11 promised rations equal to depot troops. Men said the Americans counted calories like rounds of ammunition. Carlo learned numbers the way he had once learned ranges. An American depot soldier ate around 3,400 calories a day. The quartermaster could bring that to a remote panhandle post, the way an artillery battery brings shells, by schedule and tonnage. If the menu added ice cream on Sundays, no one behaved as if it were a miracle. The miracle had been built in Detroit, Chicago, Omaha, and a tangle of rail lines that made distance look small. The first hamburger and the first bottle of Coca-Cola were the bridge from rumor to fact. The hiss of the cap sounded like something unlocked. The sweetness felt impolite at first, as if pleasure were against regulations, and then natural, as if the taste had always belonged to his mouth and he had merely gone without it for a long time. He tried to assemble the old story in which the enemy exhausted himself first. It would not stand. A system that could feed prisoners to American standards while building fleets and air forces at scales that defied comparison was not a system looking for an exit. He wrote a letter he would never send, drafting it in his head. "I think we were defeated by a kitchen." He did not mean cowardice. He meant the American conviction that law should be obeyed and promises kept, even when the promise cost meat, sugar, milk, and the time of a dozen men. He meant the quiet way a country tells you it is larger than your courage. When he finished eating, he held the empty bottle for a long moment, watching a bead of water creep down the glass and catch a stripe of sun. Night at Hereford came with floodlights and a wind that smelled faintly of rain. Men turned in on straw mattresses and rustled like fields in a gust. Somewhere a radio played a dance band show too softly to name the tune. Carlo lay still and counted, as the Neapolitan had counted. Trucks, rail cars, refrigerators, thermometers, clipboards, caps, and the small, bright hisses that added up to a verdict. He slept, believing he had heard the future, and that it sounded like a kitchen running on time. Heat built early on the high plains, lifting from the gravel in mirage shivers that made the fence posts sway. Hereford, a tidy grid pressed to a grain elevator and twin water towers, watched the new camp with the wary courtesy of decent neighbors. On market mornings, ranch trucks rattled past the gate, boards dusted cinnamon red. Men chewed toothpicks and touched two fingers to their brims for the MPS. Women in sun hats glanced over, faces bright with the complicated feeling of living beside a war that had arrived wrapped in wire and procedure instead of thunder. Inside the fence, the day divided itself into details. Straw mattresses shook into the sun. Laundry lines lifted and bellied with a small wind. A guard tower creaked as someone shifted beside the Browning M 1919.30 caliber. The loudest sounds were ordinary: boots scuffing, cutlery clinking, a rasp from the shop where chair legs were trued. Procedure set the rhythm, but the kitchen drew the eyes of men who had learned to mistrust generosity. Refrigerator doors thumped with a faithful sound. Steam lifted in patient ribbons from steel vats. The air smelled of coffee, onions, and hot bread. Rosa Delgado rode in with her father's truck and a bed stacked in neat pyramids: onions, chard, melons under damp burlap. She carried a manifest to the quartermaster office and waited while a corporal compared numbers, pencil ticking like a metronome. Captain James Tex Harlan arrived with dust on his cuffs and the quick, practical smile of a man who measured the world in supply and demand. He signed for the lot and, almost as an aside, asked whether her family could spare chilies. "Sunday stew," he said. "A little heat wouldn't hurt morale." POWs on work detail, guarded but unhurried, unloaded the produce. Carlo shouldered a crate and felt the weight bite a welcome groove into his palms. Work steadied a man. The kitchen yard smelled of onion skin, damp wood, and the faint, sweet note of melon. A GI with a red bandage showed a prisoner how to balance two crates on a hip. Words proved optional. Gravity was a shared language. When the last crate thumped down, someone laughed at nothing in particular, and the sound crossed the yard like a rumor of ordinary life. At noon, the mess line wrapped the building twice. The menu wrote its own argument: bread still warm, butter cut in perfect squares, coffee poured to the lip, and a pot of beans that tasted of smoke and patience. Over the steam table, a chalkboard listed Sunday: roast, potatoes, greens, fruit, cheese. Someone had sketched a lopsided steer in the corner. The joke felt off-duty, the kind people make only when they are safe enough to be silly. On the bulletin board, the 1929 Geneva Convention hung in 3 languages. Article 11, calm as law, same rations as U.S. depot troops. Here came the statistic that refused to live quietly. The United States would build 354,750 military aircraft before the war ended. Italy, proud and valiant though it fought, would manage something near 11,000. A single American plant, Willow Run, would, at its peak, push a B-24 off the line roughly every hour, while Italian factories measured bomber output in months. Such figures might have remained abstractions if the evidence hadn't steamed on Carlo's tray, a portion that would have fed 2 men in Tunisia, delivered here as routine. The camp read like a ledger of confidence: 10 fenced acres, barracks for 4,000, an ice house breathing the clean, medicinal cold of winter. Harlan checked a thermometer and tapped the gauge with a knuckle, satisfied. The day's temperature curve had held without drift. That, he would have said, was victory in miniature, the line that stayed level because a nation had decided it would. He walked the loading bay counting without looking. Sacks, crates, cans, bottles. Logistics lived in his bones the way marching tempo lives in a band. Rosa watched the prisoners try the butter first, spreading it carefully as if testing for a trick. When nothing happened, no whistle, no barked order, their faces loosened by degrees. She noticed Carlo's look when he stepped into the hard light by the trestle tables. Not joy, exactly, but the surprise of being allowed to be human. She thought of her brothers drilling with the Home Guard and wondered at the miles between fear and dignity, and at the short distance a good meal could travel across both. Late afternoon brought a cooler wind that lifted dust devils and made the flag snap against its halyard. Work crews stacked crates, rolled hoses, swept the loading bay until concrete showed through. The kitchen exhaust unfurled like a steady pennant over the roofs. Beyond the wire, a whistle thinned, and a refrigerated car clanked past on the main, chalk figures bright on the box side. The country kept its own appointments, and it kept them on time. When the sun leaned away, the camp settled into a noise like surf. Voices, clinks, sun-tired laughter. Carlos sat with his back to the barracks and watched Rosa climb into the truck. She tucked stray hair under her kerchief, looked once toward the wire, and lifted a hand. It was nothing. It was everything. He raised his palm in return, then turned at the crisp little hiss from the mess hall, the sound of a cap leaving a cold green bottle, and understood that tomorrow's revelation would arrive in a taste as clear as law. The griddle woke before the camp did, a broad black square already alive with sound. Fat met iron with a cheerful sizzle. A private slid patties from a tray to the heat in neat ranks, each one the same weight by feel. A second man worked the buns, fast fingers laying onions and relish in a cadence that matched the clack of the serving line. When the first bottle opened, the cap popped with the neat finality of a switch closing, and cold vapor feathered the mouth of the Coke like breath on glass. Carlo took his place and let the moment arrive. He had read the bulletin board without believing it. Article 11, Geneva 1929, equal in quantity and quality to the rations of American depot troops. Words on paper lived small in the desert. Here they lived as breakfast. Field ration A in garrison meant fresh meat, vegetables, bread with butter and jam, coffee with real sugar, and, where supply allowed, ice cream on Sundays. The quartermaster doctrine treated calories and cartridges as kin, planned, loaded, delivered. The law held because the supply chain could hold it. Captain Harlan moved the line with small corrections that looked like courtesy and were, in fact, discipline. He checked the meat thermometer, nodded at the color, and sent a runner to the ice house for another rack of bottles. He could have sketched the route blind, ice scored in slabs, caps rattling in a tin, the sharp aroma of winter air kept under lock. The chain reached back past the siding and the depot, past the stockyards and packing houses, and into the calm arithmetic of rail schedules that refused drama. America fought Germany and Japan. It also fought distance to a draw. Carlo's tray came up. A cook saluted with his spatula and settled the burger onto the bun, steam lifting like a promise. The glass bottle bit his fingers with clean cold. He tipped, and the fizz met his teeth with a bright sting. Sweetness followed salt. Iron followed heat. He stood very still, surprised by how quickly the body recognizes safety. The last weeks in Tunisia, he would later admit, had whittled him down to suspicion. This brought him back in a single swallow. It would have been easy to call the feeling gratitude and stop there. Yet what overwhelmed him was not kindness alone, but capacity. The United States had spared nothing on the far end of the wire. The Coke itself spoke logistics. By summer, the Army would sponsor bottling units from Algeria to Australia, 60-plus plants pushing millions of servings along the same roads the artillery used. The hamburgers spoke meat, rail cars, and cold storage. The coffee spoke ships and convoy escorts. The butter spoke a dairy map that reached from Texas to Wisconsin and back again by timetable. Harlan would have said the scene demonstrated doctrine in the flesh. Feed a man, and you preserve him for work. Feed a prisoner, and you preserve your own soul. The sergeants joked that the burger was a morale round, close support at the mess line. Carlo, tasting the last sweetness in the neck of the bottle, felt the joke bite true. Scarcity trains a certain heroism. Abundance trains another. The American kind put its courage in making sure the trains ran and the ice held. Across the room, Rosa stood beside a stack of trays, hair tucked under a kerchief, watching the faces change one by one. Some men ate fast, as if time might revoke the offer. Others slowed, eyes wet, and smiled at no one. The cooks kept working, aprons spattered, moving at the comfortable speed of people who know the warehouse will not come up empty. In the far corner, a corporal pried open a fresh crate, caps chattering like coins. The smell of fried beef filled the rafters, and the air took on the sound of people talking about small things again. Letters, shoes, tomorrow's weather. Carlo finished and stood with the bottle in his hand, thumb tracing the raised glass script. He would write later that a kitchen defeated him. He meant the kitchen and the law above it, and the patient river of supply that made both ordinary. He set the bottle on the counter and heard its gentle ring. Outside, a whistle thinned along the tracks, and a boxcar slid by loaded with meat on ice. The war would go on in names and maps, but a truth had already happened here. A democracy had fed its enemies to its own standard and not been diminished. The door swung, and another cool breath from the ice house moved through the hall, as punctual as a promise. The packing houses woke before the towns did, windows glowing along the Chicago River, while switch engines shuffled iced refrigerator cars toward the docks. Trace the hamburger on Carlo's tray, and the line runs through those catwalks, through stockyards that smelled of hot iron and wet sawdust, through ledgers kept in grease pencil and steam. The war's visible map, convoy lanes and front lines, hid another underneath, the one quartermasters read. Tonnage, timetables, cold chain, spoilage loss. That second map delivered breakfast. Captain James Tex Harlan thought in that hidden cartography. Logistics, he said, was keeping surprises away. He planned backward from the hiss on the griddle. Every plate meant a sequence: slaughter to packing house, packing to cold storage to rail car to siding, siding to ice house to grill. On paper, the math looked dull. In motion, it was beautiful. Men moved like pistons. When timing held, morale ran without knock. A week after Carlo's first breakfast, Harlan rode the siding with the depot agent to meet the noon consist. Heat shimmered. A whistle approached. The cars stopped with a coupler's thud. Iced doors slid to vent a faint, wintry breath. Prisoners formed a chain without being told. They moved sides of beef, tins of butter, sacks of flour, and coffee drums that left dark rings on the planks. A corporal ticked quantities from a manifest. Harlan initialed with a carpenter's economy. No speeches, only process. The manuals carried their own poetry. Field ration A for garrison. Field ration B when fresh ran short. C and K when lines moved. The 10 and 1 when small units ate in the field. Harlan liked their plainness. In Hereford, where rail met wire, A and B did the heavy lifting, supported by local farm contracts like Rosa's father's. Doctrine was simple and hard. Calories were a weapon system. Rosa learned the steps by smell. She could read a day without a clock: creosote at dawn, coffee by 7, ammonia at the ice house, then onions and scorched bread. By noon, the shade under the loading awning filled with motion, choreography with crates instead of partners. She carried manifests for Harlan to sign and compared the Army's block numbers to her father's looping hand. Totals met in the middle. That, she thought, was how democracies kept faith. Carlo often drew icehouse duty, a cavern of racks and breath ghosts where he chipped blocks with a pike and slid them under canvas around bright tins. The cold bit through his tunic and made his teeth ache. He learned the dull knock of good ice and the suspicious ring of a slab going bad at the edges. The foreman, an old sergeant with a broken nose, grunted once when Carlo caught a spoiled block before it fouled butter. competence earned small mercies. What reached the mess line came from farther still. A Coca-Cola man, traveling under Army orders, inspected caps and gaskets beside the bay and swapped out a batch whose cork liners smelled wrong. He wore khaki and walked like he belonged. Men joked about Coca-Cola kernels, but the joke carried respect. The company had promised a nickel Coke wherever the uniform went, and the Army treated that promise like a contract. Overseas, portable bottling lines were being bolted together near docks and depots. The plan called for more than 60 plants stamping out millions of bottles for men in muddy boots. If a nation mobilized sweetness with that rigor, what could it do with steel? In the evenings, the yard calmed, and the sun found the curve of a tank car, painting it with a last gleam. Carlos sat on a bollard and let his breath slow. He could feel the shape of the system now, the way daily tasks slid into place with the click of a bolt. Tomorrow's hamburger would taste like today's, not by luck, but because time and distance bowed to schedule. He thought of the desert, where chance ruled men's meals, and felt the strangeness of breakfast that kept appointments. Night bleached the gravel until shadows shrank to the fence line. A radio in the guard shack played a dance band from far away. The smell of disinfectant lifted from the scoured floor. Harlan closed his clipboard and locked the ice house. The latch made a small, decisive sound. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote barked, thin as wire. The camp exhaled to quiet, ready to draw breath at dawn. News travels strangely in wartime. It leaks under doors and rides inside letters, arriving on rumors that sound too generous to be true. Colonel Friedrich Albrecht heard one in a different key. He had served beside Italian commands in Tunisia and knew hunger. The report on his desk in a quiet office in Rome described prisoners in Texas and Oklahoma who were gaining weight. The phrase looked insolent on paper. He read it again and tapped the margin. September 8, 1943 arrived like a kicked door. The armistice broadcast thinned the air in every barracks. Some hid uniforms, some rifles, some the certainty Mussolini had sold. The world narrowed to choices. In the camps across the ocean, those choices wore a different face. U.S. officers offered Italian service units with quartermaster and engineer detachments. Work was work, calories and dignity followed. Of the roughly 51 to 55,000 Italians held in America, about 45,000 volunteered. Carlo heard the offer on a dry afternoon. The lieutenant read in a steady voice, then folded the paper like a prayer. Men looked at one another. Carlo signed. He thought of the kitchen and the law above it, and decided a man could lend his back to a system that fed even its enemies to its own standard. An armband and a change of detail followed. His first day in the ISU, he stacked crates beside a U.S. private with the politeness of a good neighbor. Albrecht's train crawled north through blackout. He tried to sleep and instead saw graphs that refused to bend. At Willow Run, an assembly line could push a B-24 once an hour at peak, an Air Force each week. A soft drink company was treated like a partner. 60-plus bottling plants would ring the theaters. Analysts joked that 5 billion servings might move before the end. A nation that mobilized sugar water like ammunition would not fail at airplanes. Rosa heard the war change in voices at the mess tables. They ate the same food, but homesickness seeped into the talk. On Sundays, some bowed their heads before the roast. She watched ISU men work in pairs with Americans, trading gestures, 2 fingers for careful, a palm to slow, a nod for good. Work taught its own Esperanto. Carlo wrote a letter he knew a censor would read. He said the camp was not paradise, only clean. He said the food was enough, the coffee strong, and the law still hung there. He described the ice house, the clicks of the meat thermometer, the way the train came on time, even in heat. He folded the paper and thought the news would do soft work no rifle squad could manage. Albrecht read another report and felt the same tug. He had believed spirit could make steel do more. Then he read the tally of prisoners who had volunteered for ISUS. the estimates of labor hours delivered into the American machine, the tidy way numbers added to numbers. He set his pencil down and imagined a Texas kitchen, a tidy clock, and men who counted futures in plates and bottles. In staff notes that month, he underlined figures that should have been impossible. At peak, an American plant could finish a heavy bomber once an hour. The soft drink program counted more than 60 overseas bottlers and was racing toward billions of bottles. In Texas, the rolls showed 45,000 Italian prisoners volunteering for service units out of a total 51 to 55,000. None of it read like propaganda. It read like a country turning appetite, habit, and law into weapons. Albrecht stared at the totals and felt strategy tilt beneath him. Autumn pulled a pale gold across the plains and set the cottonwoods shivering like coins. Carlo reported to the yard in an armband for the Italian service units and learned by watching: load, lift, listen. An American sergeant showed him to shoulder a crate, hips first, back straight, then stepped aside and let competence do its quiet diplomacy. The wire stayed, the day changed. Work came with tools, a schedule, and the dignity of being counted on. The orders named destinations that sounded like code and proved to be places. Benicia Arsenal on the Carquinez Strait, Fort Ord on a foggy bay, Mira Loma out by California Groves. ISU companies parceled by numbers left Texas in chalked groups, guarded but unhurried. At Benicia, men in Carlo's unit stacked crates stamped with ink and sap. They followed a sergeant through sheds that boomed under passing trains. Do the job right, and no one raised his voice. Fort Ord added a hiss of sea and a salt film to the skin. ISU details worked beside recruits learning to march and curse. Carlo hauled cable spools and learned American gestures. 2 fingers flicked for careful on pinch points, a flat palm to slow a dolly at the ramp. A private named Casey taught him to splice. The joint they produced took a bend like a promise. They talked about food, sisters, baseball, winters, and getting by. At Mira Loma, the work smelled of oil and canvas. Trucks nosed through the yard, and afternoons ripened to orange light. Teams inventoried tents, mess gear, boots, and blankets for trains heading to units still forming. An American corporal and an Italian electrician rebuilt a generator with a parts diagram tucked under a wrench. The motor coughed, found itself, and settled into a thrum. 2 men grinned at order returning. Rosa read the place names in small-town papers and savored that work gathered what war scattered. Hereford felt emptied in a good way, like a field after harvest. She wrote a thank you to the quartermaster at Benicia and mailed it anyway. She imagined crates moving north and marveled that it all orbited a promise on a bulletin board. The ledgers kept their own story. Where the wire had once held only captives, rolls now listed workers by company and skill. Estimates of labor hours ran to columns that meant trains loaded, depots cleared, hospitals supplied, docks turned on time. The Americans counted the contribution and rolled it into schedules that clicked like teeth. Carlo learned to read those schedules like weather, to sense pressure dropping and to feel relief when bottlenecks broke. On a Sunday at Fort Ord, after a morning on the ramps, Carlo sat with Casey and split a sandwich wrapped in waxed paper. The Pacific smelled like a tin cup in the sun. A bugle sounded something formal and far away. A carousel's thin music drifted from beyond the gate. Casey tapped the bottle in Carlo's hand and said, "A man could get used to this," meaning he trusted tomorrow to resemble today. Carlo weighed the line and gave the word he had been learning. Yes. Letters from home still came thin and shy of ink. Sometimes the censor's cuts looked like snow. His sister wrote that the grocer was kinder than the prices, that the church was cold on Sundays. He answered with small things the censors would pass: the noise a hand truck makes at a floor seam, the way hot rope smells, the comfort of a chart with boxes filled. He did not say that he had stopped dreaming in deserts. He did not need to. At month's end, the unit mustered for pay in camp scrip and a brief speech from a captain. He said schedules were a kind of courage. because they told a frightened world what the next hour intended. Carlo folded the script into his pocket, touched the edge of his armband, and felt steadiness in being useful. A train hooted twice. Men stood, stretched their backs, and reached for crates like reaching for themselves. The work would not earn medals, he thought, but it would move armies, and that truly felt like a kind of honest victory. Benicia Arsenal woke like a forge. Morning fog lifted off the straight, and the yard boss's whistle found every ear. Carlo's ISU crew fell in behind a sergeant with a clipboard. Pallets rolled. Chalk marks became cargo. The day stretched as a list made true. By 9, the first convoy idled at the gate, engines grumbling like they had dreamed all night. The sergeant touched his pencil to a line, and the trucks began to inhale the depot. A run like that taught scale better than any briefing. Crates stacked and vanished with the clean logic of water draining, and aisles opened like new streets. A private pointed toward more boxcars and said without pride, "That'll do it again by evening." Carlo had seen depots in Africa cough out supplies and then sit empty. Here the place seemed to refill while you blinked, as if gravity ran both ways here. The Americans called it flow. Schedules aligned so a tailgate kissed a dock at the right minute. Paperwork arrived correct. The return passed icehouse, fuel, and mess at the hour appetite showed up. Missing any part insulted the whole. When the second convoy left, the yard boss studied the chalk on the concrete and declared the floor good as new. It was policy. A clean floor meant a clean count. Carlo learned the numbers the way a man learns a song. He already knew the verdict numbers. The United States building more than 350,000 aircraft, while Italy counted near 11,000. Willow Run pushing a B-24 roughly once an hour at peak. More than 60 overseas Coke bottlers chasing billions of bottles to men under arms. At Benicia, the impossible wore a smaller face. A morning convoy that emptied sheds until they rang, followed by an afternoon train that laid the day's lost weight neatly back on the docks. He could hear the nation breathing in those swings. Rosa, who had never seen the Pacific before the war, watched the straight shoulder, a cargo ship through the channel, and felt that same breath. The tugboat cleared its throat, and the ship obeyed. On shore, an ISU crew in canvas gloves stepped in unison with American longshoremen, a small dance of trust. She had grown up where a broken axle stranded a family. Here breakdowns looked like pauses. A man walked to a phone. Another arrived with a part. The day smoothed itself. The sergeant liked to say doctrine lives in a broom as much as in a manual. He recited the quartermaster catechism: protect the package, preserve the count, keep the line, and enforced it with a push broom. Dust hid numbers. A swept bay made arithmetic honest. At noon, a train rolled in with a zipper sound. The boxcar doors shrugged open on crates, tins, drums, and coils of wire that gleamed like lines on a map. A whistle blew 5 quicks, and teams flowed to their marks. Carlo and an American he knew only as Flores moved a drum together. Flores said his brother worked a night shift in Detroit pouring V-12 blocks for fighters, and that plant lights made midnight look like noon. He said a single building there could spit out more power in a day than some countries pulled in a season. Carlo believed him without seeing it. He had learned the sound truth made when it wore progress. By late afternoon, the convoys drew the yard down twice, and the rails built it back twice. The boss's whistle blew the day to a stop. Men leaned on pallets and let the weight leave their arms. A gull cried, indignant at everything. Rosa sat on a coil and drank from a cold green bottle with the calm of someone who trusts she can have another tomorrow. Carlo watched steam lift from his shirt and tried to remember the trick of going hungry and could not. Across the water, a ship's horn traded notes with a train. Behind the sheds, a radio spilled dance music. The yard smelled of rope and oil and promise. When the floodlights came up, the sheds brightened like stages waiting on actors who knew their lines. Flores clapped Carlo on the shoulder and said, Same again in the morning. Carlo nodded and said the word he trusted now, the one that fit both men and machines. Yes. He turned to count the stacks and found he had stopped fearing empty spaces. In this country, emptiness was only the shape that waited for the next delivery. The night took the yard and left the ledger tidy. The ledger closed on time, always. The town ball field lay just beyond the depot fence, a wedge of green ironed flat against the hard pan by chalk and care. On Saturdays, the home guard met a cannery 9, and benches filled with uniforms and work shirts in equal measure. Carlo stood at the backstop with other Italian service unit men, the wire imprinting diamonds on their shadows. When the first pitch popped the mitt, a cheer went up, a clean sound that did not belong to any language but the afternoon. A corporal passed a PX crate along until it reached Carlo. The bottle bit cold into his palm. He lifted it and heard the bright psst he now associated with mercy made punctual. The fizz kissed his teeth. It tasted right. Around him the talk drifted from chow to weather, from a radio show to a sister in Ohio who worked nights at a plant. The words braided into a language that needed no dictionary. Tomorrow, again, enough. Letters traveled slower than trains, but they traveled. Carlo wrote carefully, knowing a censor would pass his lines under a ruler. He described a kitchen that would have felt like rumor in Tunisia. Meat meeting the griddle on time, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon, butter in squares, bread still warm. He did not name the brand on the green glass. He folded the page and imagined a table in Lombardy with one more kind story on it. Across the ocean, Colonel Friedrich Albrecht read an intelligence brief that did not argue. It counted. Reports noted Italian prisoners volunteering by the tens of thousands for service units, then balanced their labor hours against Allied schedules and found the totals agreeable. Another sheet sketched the empire of sweetness, more than 60 bottling plants overseas and millions upon millions of servings. One line, almost tossed away, observed that a single American plant at peak could deliver a heavy bomber once an hour, while Italy still measured such machines by the month. Baseball worked on Carlo like a salve. He learned the names in pieces: shortstop, double play, steal, and watched men move according to rules everyone accepted before the bell. Between innings, the bandstand crackled with a swing tune from Amarillo. Rosa sat near third base with a paper sack of sliced peaches and passed them down the row. When a pop fly arced toward the wire, an ISU man reached through, then drew his hand back. No need to be greedy, not here. Soft power lived in such hours. Men were treated as men, and it did its work. Morale did not collapse with a speech. It leaned, degree by degree, each time the law proved itself with coffee and meat and a nickel bottle that arrived on time. Albrecht carried the brief to his quarters and read it again. He had trusted doctrine to rescue deficit. Doctrine mattered, so did steel. A footnote estimated that by war's end, the Coca-Cola program would top 5 billion bottles to servicemen. 5 billion moments when a cap hissed and a soldier heard proof that supply outran fear. After the game, bottles clinked into a crate like coins into a church box. People drifted home through a wind smelling of cut grass and diesel. Carlo walked the fence and felt peace run ahead of him, unworried, as if it knew the way. He palmed the smooth curve of glass and thought of the first time he wept at the taste. Abundance had taught him a stricter courage, to admit that a just enemy with full larders and full schedules could win and still leave the world better than it found it. The scoreboard bulbs went dark one by one. A locomotive's whistle stitched the evening, and somewhere a radio signed off with the anthem in static and brass. Carlo turned the empty bottle in his hand until the raised script caught the last light. He set it in the crate and listened to its gentle ring. The sound was small and exact and perfectly timed. It felt like a verdict delivered without malice, the kind a man accepts because every clock in the yard keeps the same time. In Washington, the room smelled of paper, pencil shavings, and the faint ozone tang of new fluorescent tubes. War Department analysts bent over charts where lines climbed steeper than hills. The graph explained. At the top ran a simple comparison: United States aircraft production to date versus Italy's total capability. The American line widened like a river at flood. The Italian tally stood narrow and brave and doomed. At the board's edge, a clerk wrote totals with a quiet, careful hand. To Captain James Harlan, numbers were not decorations. They were orders a nation gave itself. Quartermaster lists for beef, coffee, sugar, flour, and milk fat stacked up like troop rosters in his head. Calories per man per day, 3,400 in depot, sat beside railcar allotments and icehouse capacity. The measurability ran outward into policy. The board listed totals: 354,750 American aircraft before war's end against roughly 11,000 Italian. 60-plus overseas Coca-Cola plants aiming at 5 billion bottles. Depot rations at 3,400 calories per man. Another card tallied Tunisia, more than 238,000 Axis prisoners, and a note on Italian service units. 45,000 volunteers from a U.S. POW population of about 51 to 55,000. The 1929 Geneva Convention's Article 11 had not been a gesture, it had been a budget line. If a prisoner ate like a depot soldier, then cattle cars moved, cold rooms hummed, and coffee ships tied up on schedule. The law stood because the spindles of the supply machine turned. The numbers left no place for wishes. They turned hope into counted fact. Across an ocean and a continent, in Texas, Carlo Bianchi saw none of these charts, only their shadows on the ground. The refrigerator thermometer traced a steady curve. The manifest matched the pallets. The burger arrived looking like yesterday's. He had learned to trust the schedule on a chalkboard the way a gunner trusts the dial. Abundance, he understood, was a doctrine with numbers. Colonel Friedrich Albrecht sat with a thin folder and counted the same way, but from the other side of the war. He had believed that training and aggression could narrow deficits of materiel. The folder undid the hope by arithmetic. Prisoners in America, roughly 51 to 55,000. Volunteers to Italian service units among them, 45,000. Labor hours converted to dock turnarounds, to depot throughput, to miles of road repaired, to cases moved from rail to truck. Another sheet recapitulated North Africa's final tally: more than 238,000 Axis prisoners in Tunisia. That figure floated like a buoy over everything else. The analysts drafted a note to pass from desk to desk. Morale, they wrote, was both consumable and conserved. It rose where promise matched delivery and fell where schedules became wishes. Democratic industry made promise and delivery the same word. Therefore, a hamburger in a Texas camp under Article 11 was not mere kindness. It was a strategic message delivered in meat and sugar to enemies and allies both. Harlan did not see that memo. He saw the day's ledger close without error, and the icehouse seal with a click that sounded like a lock finding home. Rosa saw it in a family planning around the Army check that cleared on time. Carlo heard it in the dependable clatter of plates. Albrecht, studying the folder's last page, understood it in silence. The graphs did not demand surrender. They taught it. The analyst's pencil stopped. He wrote a single sentence in the margin for whoever read the page next. "We have built a system that cannot fail without the whole nation noticing at once." The bell rang for the end of the shift. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere, a mimeograph machine coughed out the next set of orders. Spring edged the bar ditch green and lifted a smell of wet dirt from the gravel. News arrived as rumor, then as headline on the bulletin board, then as bells in town: pushes west, breaks east, Germany wobbling. In camp, the rhythm held while the temperature changed. Carlo loaded crates in the cool and watched breath vanish from the air. He had grown used to work that began with a list and ended with a signature. Leaving the bay, he sometimes passed Rosa with her father's truck and tipped his cap. She asked if the kitchen still wanted chilies. Captain Harlan signed for produce and said the coffee was holding steady. Order made food appear and trains depart, and now it began to speak in larger sentences. Officials inspected Italian service unit records and left satisfied. A major thanked Benicia crews for dock turnarounds that ran like a second hand. A man in a plain suit counted hospital cots and added that good beds borrowed courage from tomorrow. Carlo thought of dividend without naming it, strength that came when dignity and fuel moved in the same direction. On Sundays, he sat on a ramp with Casey, splitting a sandwich by habit. Casey talked about a sister who had found hands she did not know she had on a factory line. Carlo answered with his father tallying wine jugs by candle. They traded blurred photographs and learned one another's weather. March blew through. April stilled, as if the country took a breath. News of surrender settled more than broke. At Hereford, the floodlights burned and the kitchen woke on time. The board said repatriation would begin in stages. Lists followed, each name a hinge clicking. Rosa brought extra fruit and tucked a peach into Carlo's pocket with the ease of a sister. He thanked her with a nod and the small American word he had learned. Sure. Men lined for medical checks and inoculations, for lectures about trains to ports and ships to home. Carlo listened for the statistic he trusted, that the schedule would hold, and found it on every page. Harlan gathered the kitchen crew and read instructions for turning over utensils and stores. Clean what you borrowed better than you found it, he said. Carlo memorized the sentence. It matched the other law in his life now. Feed people like you promised to. On his last evening before the outbound column claimed his name, he walked the perimeter at dusk. Creosote and warm metal scented the air. The wire sang a little under wind. Past the yard, a locomotive huffed and fell quiet, as if full lungs did not yet know what to do with peace. At the canteen door, the Coca-Cola man shook Harlan's hand and promised the last delivery would be on time. 5 billion was a number Carlo would never see, but the hiss had carried him through days without invention. He bought a bottle and drank slowly under the eave while moths tested the light. Across the yard, men wrote letters that would outrun them, and another crew boxed the ledgers that had kept the camp honest. Rosa arrived late with her father. She handed Carlo a small paper sack, a few pecans, a pencil stub, a folded picture of the ball field. It was everything they could spare that a man could carry far. He felt the weight and the size of the gift matched perfectly. Twice he woke to the radio murmuring dance music, then a voice naming towns that had finally met their clocks. Between dreams, he thought about the line of workmen's backs moving like a tide and about the icehouse breath that smelled like January and July. He bore no malice toward the schedule that had defeated him. He had lived inside it long enough to know its mercy. He exhaled. Morning rolled in on a pale sky. The train stood with car doors open like held breath. Carlo folded the sack into his pocket, touched the raised script on the green glass one last time, and stepped toward the platform with the steadiness of a man who has learned what promises are worth. Years later, the sky looked unchanged, big enough to carry a man's memory without crowding it. On a summer afternoon, Carlo Bianchi stepped from a rental car and stood at the edge of a field that had once been wire and watchtowers. The towers were gone. A grain truck drowsed along a section road where the main gate had stood. He carried a bottle of Coca-Cola in a paper sack from a gas station where the clerk called him sir. He walked to the modest stone chapel the prisoners had raised from scavenged materials and sat. A pickup turned off the road. Rosa Delgado climbed down with the measured care of someone who has spent a lifetime doing real work. They shook hands without surprise. Behind her, children ran the way children run when the land is flat, straight, laughing, sure. Captain Harlan had long since taken his competence to civilian life, cooperative, school board, the useful offices. Rosa said the coffee was still holding steady. Carlo laughed and felt the desert leave him another degree. They walked the perimeter by memory. Rosa pointed to where the icehouse had breathed winter into summer and to the bay where he had shouldered crates next to Casey. Carlo remembered the ball field, the bandstand, the chalked scoreboard numbers that still shaped how he trusted a day. They spoke of small things that had not been small: a pencil stub, a bag of pecans, a peach pressed into his pocket. Rosa brought the camp's clipping book, yellowed newsprint, a photograph of ISU men unloading a boxcar, a receipt in Harlan's plain hand. The receipts looked like prayer, promises made and kept. It rang true. He opened the bottle. The shade felt kind. Enough. The cap hissed the old note, bright and ordinary. The taste had not changed. A museum volunteer arrived, apologizing for being late. Carlo told him the chapel mattered, the kitchen mattered, the bulletin board mattered, and that the only statistics the wind would remember were that hungry men ate and that trains came on time. They sat in the chapel longer than they needed to. Rosa said her grandson would ship out soon and had asked whether the stories were true. She had told him the ones that fit in a boy's hand. Carlo said his grandchildren's English outpaced their Italian, and that when they asked why he cried over a hamburger and a bottle of soda, he answered plain: law kept and abundance delivered. Later he added the numbers: Africa's 238,000 prisoners, America's hundreds of thousands of planes, the 5 billion bottles promised, and watched their eyes widen at the system that made such scale ordinary. Back at the car, he tore a page from a notebook and wrote to a historical society in Lombardy. Would they like a photograph of the chapel and a memory beside it, that a kitchen on the far side of the ocean had obeyed a convention and changed a man? He signed it with the same hand that had once lifted a crate on a Texas dock and felt strength run back up his arm. Rosa pressed his fingers and drove away in a cloud of dust that settled like talc. Carlo stayed until the bottle warmed. He poured the last swallow onto the baked ground as a libation to promises kept. A train spoke from far off, stitching the horizon to itself. Elsewhere, a classroom watched a newsreel, assembly lines birthing bombers, stockyards moving rivers of beef, neat rows of crates, men laughing over green glass. A teacher explained Article 11 and the arithmetic of rations, and an old man in the back nodded. The lesson closed with a question about victory and what it required. The old man did not raise his hand. He looked out at an American afternoon and answered privately. It required a people willing to put law on a wall, then build a kitchen big enough to keep it true. He capped the answer with the smallest sound a bottle makes when it touches wood and knew the sound would carry farther than any speech. Today,